I found a dented old tin box in my late husband's workshop, buried behind a loose brick in the chimney foundation, 3 years after he died. A thin layer of soot clung to the lid, and when I pried it open with a butter knife the first time, the hinges creaked like an old floorboard. Inside, folded into a square no bigger than a postage stamp, sat a single sheet of yellow legal paper covered in Frank's unmistakable blocky handwriting. The note said, "If our son Mark ever asks you to cash out your retirement, do not trust him. Protect yourself. I failed to teach him integrity. Save yourself." That scrap of paper, brittle and afraid, would eventually lead me to take ownership of the very house my son and his wife tried to steal from me. Right now, I live on the upper floor of that house while they rent the basement, and just inside my front door, mounted in a simple black frame and sealed behind glass, hangs the eviction notice they once filed against me. My name is Claire. I am 55 years old and by training a bookkeeper, but the credential that mattered was the 31 years I spent working alongside my husband Frank in his family's locksmith business. I kept the ledgers, yes, cross-referenced every invoice against parts inventory, reconciled the bank accounts every month without error. But Frank also taught me, slowly and patiently, how to read every kind of lock a person can buy, from a basic pin tumbler to high-security dimple locks that make most burglars walk away. He taught me tension, binding order, the whisper of a shear line, and by the time he died I could pick a Schlage deadbolt in under 2 minutes with nothing but a hook and a torsion wrench. I never imagined I would use that skill for anything beyond the occasional locked filing cabinet. It turned out to be the engine of my survival. Frank and I had one son, Mark. He was our rainbow baby after years of disappointment, bright and shiny and magnetically charming. Frank poured every free weekend into that kid, teaching him to throw a curveball, building Pinewood derby cars with more care than he ever gave a commercial lock installation. I loved Mark too, but Frank's adoration for him was the kind that fills a room until there's no oxygen left for anyone else, least of all me. I think Frank sensed something unsettled in Mark even then, a brittleness underneath the charm, because in the last 5 years of his life he started saying strange things like, "The boy has my ambition, but none of my caution," or "Watch his friends. They tell you who he wants to be." I nodded and filed it away as a father's worry. When Frank collapsed in the driveway from a sudden cardiac event 3 years ago, the grief hit me like a wave that never receded, just pulled back far enough to let me breathe before crashing again. The funeral was a blur of black dresses and casseroles, and through it all Mark and his wife, Lisa, stood at the front of the receiving line with hands folded like they were running for office. 2 days after the burial, before the last platter of cold cuts had been cleared from my kitchen, they arrived at my door with matching suitcases and a leather portfolio. They didn't come to comfort me. They came to manage me. The morning after the burial, I walked into the garage, not really sure what I was looking for. Frank's workshop occupied the back corner under a bare bulb, the concrete floor dark with decades of metal shavings and 3-in-1 oil. I was thinking about a set of beginner lock picks he had given me on our 10th anniversary, a small leather case with a half diamond, a short hook, and 3 tension tools of different thicknesses. He had held my hands in his and shown me how to rake a master padlock while the kids, Mark and a neighbor girl I barely remember, played in the yard. I wanted to hold that case again, to feel something that was just Frank and me, without the weight of all that fatherhood. But the case wasn't on the pegboard where I remembered. I searched the shelves, moved a stereo coated in sawdust, and that's when I noticed the brick. It sat in the chimney stack about 3 feet off the ground, a single red brick that protruded maybe a 1/4 inch beyond its neighbors. I had cleaned that garage 100 times and never seen it. Grief does strange things to your attention, or maybe Frank had intended for me to find it only when I was desperate enough to look. I worked the brick loose with a screwdriver, scraping my knuckles on the mortar, and behind it was a cavity just large enough for a tin box the size of a thick paperback. The box was dented on one corner, the metal cool and slightly greasy, and it was locked with a tiny wafer tumbler I recognized from dozens of cheap document safes. I had no key, but in the glove box of my car I still kept Frank's old beginner set, the same one I'd been looking for, because I had stashed it there after he died and forgotten. I retrieved it, knelt on the cold garage floor, and went to work. The wafer lock was a 5-wafer mechanism with no security pins, the kind you can defeat with a light tension and a careful rake. I inserted the torsion tool into the bottom of the keyway and applied just enough pressure to bind, then worked the half diamond up and down with a gentle scrubbing motion, listening with my whole body the way Frank taught me. The first wafer clicked at 30 seconds. The second followed 10 seconds later. I had to reset twice when my hands shook from the combination of grief and adrenaline, but eventually the plug rotated and the lid lifted with a soft sigh. Inside was nothing but that single sheet of yellow legal paper, folded so tightly the creases were white. I unfolded it and read Frank's words. If our son Mark ever asks you to cash out your retirement, do not trust him. Protect yourself. I failed to teach him integrity. Save yourself. The ink was black ballpoint, the letters leaning slightly right the way Frank's always did when he was in a hurry, but every line was deliberate. I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. A cold, particular dread settled into my bones like frost forming on a window pane. I folded the note back into its square, slipped it into the pocket of my jeans, and replaced the brick. The box I kept in my pocket too, the weight of it a small anchor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the people you love most are the ones you have to watch closest. That same afternoon, Mark and Lisa sat me down at my own kitchen table with a pot of coffee and a plate of biscotti Lisa had brought in a crinkly cellophane bag. The table was old oak, scarred from years of homework and holiday dinners, and they placed their leather portfolio on it like a Bible. Mark spoke first, his voice soft and practiced, the same tone he used to pitch software upgrades to corporate clients. "Mom, we're worried about you here alone. The stairs, the maintenance, the isolation. Dad's gone. You need support." Lisa nodded along, her honey blonde hair perfectly waved, her sympathy so thick I could have scraped it off with a paint knife. They had a plan. I would sell my house, combine the equity with the balance of my IRA, and use the total to pay off their remaining mortgage. In exchange, they would build me a fully finished basement apartment with a private entrance, a small kitchenette, and a lifetime right of occupancy. Legal contract, Mark assured me ironclad. "You'll be secure, Mom. No landlord can ever push you out. It's family." I felt the faint vibration of Frank's note against my thigh. I looked at them both, made my eyes watery and a little lost, and said in a voice I let tremble, "I don't know. My mind feels so foggy since your father died. I just can't think straight about money anymore." That was a lie. My mind was a spreadsheet, but I needed them to believe I was weak, confused, and easy mark. The look they exchanged across the table was quick and electric, a glance of pure hungry satisfaction, and in that half-second I knew Frank's warning was not paranoia. It was prophecy. Over the next 3 weeks, the pressure campaign escalated by the day. Mark appeared with glossy brochures for assisted living facilities, ones with names like Willow Creek and Sunrise Manor, and he told me the waiting lists were dozens deep, that if I didn't act soon, I would lose my spot and be stuck alone in a house I couldn't manage. Lisa began to clear my china cabinet without asking, wrapping my mother's rose-patterned dishes in newspaper and stacking them in boxes labeled Donate. She told me there wouldn't be room in the new basement apartment for all this clutter, that I needed to simplify. I watched her handle my grandmother's gravy boat and said nothing. My compliance was a performance I rehearsed in the bathroom mirror. They brought in a lawyer, a slick young man with a briefcase so new the leather still smelled of the store. He presented a draft contract on crisp white paper. I read it 4 times on the pretext of being confused by the language, and on the 4th pass I found the trap. The clause that granted me life tenancy was made expressly contingent on my continued good health and compliance with household rules to be determined by the homeowners. The homeowners would be Mark and Lisa. They could declare me in violation at any time, for any reason, and begin eviction proceedings with 30 days' notice. I let them watch me squint at the pages and complain about the small print. "It all looks like gibberish to me," I said, rubbing my temples. "My head just aches." They escalated. Mark called me one evening, voice cracking with manufactured desperation, and said their lender had started foreclosure proceedings on the Oak Park house because Lisa had lost her job, and they'd fallen 6 months behind. He told me his children, my grandchildren, would be homeless unless I acted now. I knew it was very likely a fabrication, but I let it hang in the air like smoke. Lisa called separately 40 minutes later and told me, her own voice cracking, that they might have to move to another state to find work, and I would never see my grandchildren again. The guilt trip was a sledgehammer swung by a toddler, but it was effective enough to make a weaker woman crumble. I didn't crumble. I had already, without their knowledge, engaged my own real estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Vance who specialized in elder asset protection. I had found her by searching online reviews from a library computer, leaving no trail on my home devices. Patricia was 60 years old, wore gray suits, and had eyes like a hawk. I told her everything, showed her the draft contract. She read it in 3 minutes and said, "They're trying to strip you of all rights. We're going to write a counter-contract that burns them to the ground if they breach." Over 2 evenings, in her office while Mark and Lisa thought I was at a grief support group, Patricia drafted an agreement that changed everything. In exchange for my entire IRA, $110,000, plus the net proceeds from the sale of my home, the Oak Park property would be placed into an irrevocable trust with a neutral third-party trustee. The trust would fund the construction of the basement apartment to code within 6 months and grant me an irrevocable life estate that could not be revoked for any reason short of my written, notarized consent. The real venom was in the default clause. If Mark and Lisa breached any material term, the trust would, upon my petition to a court, transfer full title of the property to me free and clear of any encumbrances. The new contract also required them to carry title insurance that would notify me of any liens or refinance attempts. I presented the revised contract to them as Patricia's work, though I let them believe I had simply taken it to a nice lawyer who helps seniors for a quick look. I told them Patricia had insisted on the trust for my protection, but I didn't really understand it, rolling my eyes as if it was bureaucratic nonsense. Mark read it quickly, a hunger in his eyes, and I could see him calculating that the payoff was still $110,000 in cash plus the house equity, nearly $250,000 in total. Lisa signed first, her signature a flourish of loops. Mark hesitated for 3 full seconds, then signed too. They hugged me, told me I was a wonderful mother, and never once asked to speak to Patricia directly. The trap was set. I liquidated my IRA the following week. The early withdrawal penalty and the income tax hit were brutal, shaving nearly 40% off the balance, but the net that landed in the escrow account was still $78,000. Combined with the $240,000 from the sale of my house, a place I'd lived for 28 years and sold in 8 days to a cash buyer, the total wire to the trustee was $318,000. The trustee paid off Mark's existing mortgage directly, extinguishing his primary debt, and reserved the remainder for construction. I watched the numbers on my bank statement vanish and felt a strange calm. Frank's note was still in my pocket. Moving day felt like an amputation. I packed 2 suitcases, my lock-picking tools, and the tin box, leaving behind a lifetime of furniture and photographs that Lisa promised she would curate for the new apartment. She did not curate them. She sold most of it at a garage sale 2 weekends later and kept the cash, a detail I learned only months later from a neighbor. The basement apartment was functional if cold, its walls cheap drywall painted a uniform beige, its windows small rectangles near the ceiling that let in gray light. But I had a door with a deadbolt that I installed myself, and I had a folding table and a laptop and my cloud storage. And I had the acoustics of the entire house filtering down through the floor joists like a radio broadcast. Living in the basement of your betrayer gives you an auditory vantage point no security system can match. Every footstep transmits a map of intent. I learned to distinguish Mark's anxious pacing from Lisa's light, dismissive strides. I learned that the kitchen was directly above my bed, and that if I lay very still at 10 in the morning, I could hear every word of his phone calls. I began keeping a digital audio log on my phone, time-stamped and auto-uploaded to a cloud account they could not access because I used a VPN and a new email address. By the end of the first week, the red flags were stacking like cordwood. Mark took frantic calls from a private lender around 10 each morning, his voice pitched low and fast, using words like asset-backed, bridge loan, and equity extraction. I heard him say 200,000 twice, and my stomach dropped. Lisa began buying things that made no sense for a couple supposedly on the brink of foreclosure just months earlier. A new sectional sofa arrived on a truck with white glove delivery, its leather so pale it was almost white. A few days later, she showed me a pair of diamond stud earrings she claimed were cubic zirconia. but I recognized the distinctive robin's egg blue of a Tiffany bag she had hastily buried in the recycling bin. They were burning through money like arsonists, and I needed to understand the fire. I started reconstructing their financial picture from fragments. Lisa had a habit of leaving credit card statements on the kitchen island, and when I walked upstairs to get a glass of water, I would memorize numbers. A balance of $22,000 on a platinum Visa, a minimum payment of $900. Mark occasionally left his laptop open, and once I glimpsed a HELOC statement with an outstanding balance of $83,000. I knew how to read a general ledger, and the picture it painted was of a couple who had cashed out every asset they could touch and were now desperately trying to paper over the hole with more debt. Then came the accident that opened the door I needed most. Lisa had bought a massive ornate mirror from a consignment store, the kind with a gilded frame that weighed maybe 40 pounds. She decided to hang it in the upstairs hallway herself, using a single plastic drywall anchor. The crash, when it came, shook the entire house. I rushed upstairs to find a 3-foot section of plaster wall torn away, the mirror in shards on the floor, and behind the wreckage, something improbable. An old floor safe set into the studs, its steel door painted the same beige as the walls, invisible until the drywall failed. Mark came running and went pale as milk. "I didn't know that was there," he whispered, more to himself than us. The previous owners had obviously framed around it and never mentioned it. Lisa's eyes lit up like a slot machine. "Well, open it," she hissed. "There might be something inside." Mark fiddled with the dial for 20 minutes, then attacked it with a crowbar until his hands blistered, but the safe didn't budge. "I'll call a locksmith in the morning," he grumbled, and I nodded sympathetically. Of course he didn't call a locksmith. The next afternoon, while Mark was at a business meeting and Lisa was at the salon, I walked upstairs carrying a small canvas bag that held my stethoscope, a set of manual dial manipulation tools, and a graphing pad. The safe was a Sentry, an older model with a 3-wheel mechanical lock and no relocker, the kind that relies on the precision of its gates rather than brute force. I had not manipulated a safe dial since my 20s, when Frank and I used to practice on a floor safe he'd salvaged from a demolition site, but muscle memory is a stubborn thing. I pressed the stethoscope against the door just below the dial, closed my eyes, and began graphing contact points. The process was meditative. I turned the dial slowly, feeling for the subtle resistance of the drive cam, marking each number where the fence dropped into a wheel gate. The first wheel took 20 minutes because my fingers were stiff, and my mind kept drifting to the note in my pocket. But then the rhythm returned, the old patience Frank had called the locksmith's prayer, and I found the second wheel at 72 and the third at 41. When the bolt slid back with a deep, satisfying clunk, my hands were perfectly steady. Inside the safe were 2 items, a manila folder thick with documents, and a second folder, fat with banded stacks of $100 bills, at least 40,000 by the look of it. I didn't touch the cash. The documents were the real prize. I carried them to the kitchen table, sat under the bright light, and began to read. The folder contained original signed copies of a cash-out refinance Mark and Lisa had executed 4 months after my move-in, just after the ink on my life estate had dried. They had pulled $200,000 in equity against the house, and to do so they had filed a subordination agreement that supposedly subordinated my trust's protective lien to the new mortgage. My signature on that subordination agreement was a lazy forgery, the slant all wrong, the loop on the C in Claire completely missing, the pressure so consistent it was clearly traced. They had also taken out a personal line of credit in both their names, and buried in the loan docs was a supplemental guarantee page listing me as a co-guarantor, with another forged signature. They had set me up to be legally liable for their debt if they defaulted, which, given their spending, was a matter of when not if. But the truly chilling evidence was a stack of email printouts between Mark and Lisa's personal accounts. I read them in order, my heart hammering. The earliest email was from Lisa to Mark, dated 3 days after I moved in. "We need to speed up the timeline. The RIFI appraisal is in 2 weeks. Once that closes, we can trigger the eviction loophole. I talked to Dr. Henderson about writing a letter saying she's a fall risk. He'll do it for $500. Mark's reply, "Perfect. Mom's IRA will finance our freedom. Just make sure the life estate clause doesn't block the equity pull." Another email from Lisa a month later. "The subordination doc is ready. I practiced her signature a dozen times. It's not great, but the notary won't check. We just need her out of the way before the next tax assessment. The final email from Mark: I want the basement cleared by spring. Converted into an income suite and charge $1,800. She can go to state care. We'll tell the court she's delusional. I set the pages down carefully, as if they were radioactive. My son and his wife had planned from the first hour to drain me, frame me, and discard me. I felt a grief that was older and sharper than the grief of Frank's death, the grief of knowing I had raised a person capable of this. But I also felt a clarity so pure it was almost cold. I photographed every page with my phone, 53 images in all, and uploaded them to my cloud drive in an encrypted folder labeled Insurance. Then I resealed the documents in the folder exactly as I had found them, replaced them in the safe, and closed the door. I didn't relock it. Let them think it had been open all along. My mind was already moving to the next phase, finding an ally who could turn this evidence into consequences. The ally arrived sooner than I expected. I had called the bank's anonymous fraud hotline from a prepaid flip phone I bought at a gas station, using a voice that was flat and unmemorable to report that I had reason to believe a recent mortgage application contained forged signatures. I didn't give my name. 2 days later, a knock on my basement door at precisely 9 a.m. revealed a woman in a dark pantsuit, maybe 50, with a briefcase and an expression that suggested she had seen every fraud in the book and was no longer surprised by any of them. She introduced herself as Alicia Marsh, Senior Vice President of Risk Management at the bank. She said an internal review triggered by my anonymous call had flagged the subordination agreement, and the signature discrepancy was so egregious that her compliance team had opened a formal investigation. She asked if I was Claire Beckett. I nodded. She asked if I had signed that document. I said no. She asked if I was willing to help her build a criminal case. I said yes. Alicia sat at my small kitchen table and laid out what she knew. She had already pulled the full loan file and discovered that the notary stamp on the subordination agreement was fraudulent, the notary's name lifted from a retired notary in a different county. She had also, through her own channels, contacted the title insurance company and found something extraordinary. 3 years before Frank died, he had taken out a small whole-life insurance policy on himself and, at the advice of our estate attorney, added a rider that created a dormant contingent trust tied to Mark's property. The trust held a security interest in the Oak Park house that was senior to any mortgage, but it was structured as a dead man's switch. If Mark ever attempted to encumber or sell the property without my physical, notarized presence and consent, the trust would automatically convert into a first-position lien for the full original purchase price of the home. The lien would make the house unsellable and unrefinanceable until it was satisfied, and only I could trigger or release it with a sworn affidavit and a verified copy of my identification. Frank had set this up years ago, long before the IRA conversation, as if he had seen the whole future unfolding. Alicia told me the title company had missed the rider when Mark first bought the house, but it was still legally enforceable. "Your husband," she said, "built you a bomb shelter out of paper." I sat there for a long moment, the weight of Frank's love pressing on my chest. He had not only warned me, he had armed me. Alicia then laid out the plan. She needed 2 more pieces of evidence to make the case airtight: a recorded admission from Mark that I had not signed the subordination agreement, and a digital capture of the original signature template he had used to create the forgeries. She handed me a small device that looked like a generic USB flash drive, but was actually a rubber ducky-style keystroke and file extractor, preloaded with scripts that would copy every graphic file and recent document from Mark's computer. She showed me how to insert it into the back of his desktop, hidden behind the wedding photo he never moved, and how to remove it after 30 seconds when the activity light stopped blinking. I told her I could do both. I engineered the recording 2 mornings later. Mark was pacing the kitchen, furious because the bank had frozen the RIFI proceeds without explanation, and he'd been on hold for 40 minutes with some manager who kept stonewalling. I climbed the basement stairs leaning heavily on the banister, my face slack and bewildered, and said, "Honey, I got a strange call from a bank asking if I'd signed anything recently." I told them I don't remember signing a thing, my memory's so bad these days. "Did I sign something for you?" I saw the calculation flicker behind his eyes. He needed me forgetful. He needed me useless. "No, Mom," he said, his voice instantly soothing. You didn't sign anything. Some paper got mixed up with your name on it, probably a computer error from the old trust paperwork. Don't worry about it. I'll handle it. That single sentence, spoken clearly and calmly, was an admission that the signature on the subordination agreement was not mine. My phone, recording in my cardigan pocket, captured every syllable. That afternoon, while Mark showered and Lisa shopped, I slipped into their home office. The desktop computer sat under a window, its tower half hidden behind a framed wedding photo. I knew from months of observation that Mark never dusted back there, never checked the ports. I inserted the USB device, felt the faint warmth of it powering on, and watched the activity light pulse for 28 seconds. When it went dark, I pulled it out and slipped it into my pocket. The entire operation took less time than brewing a cup of coffee. The maximum cruelty beat happened 3 days later, and it was entirely my own design. I needed to know if there was any molecule of the boy I had raised still alive inside the man who had forged my name. So I staged a medical episode. I set up a small motion-activated camera hidden in a potted philodendron in the living room, angled to cover the hallway and kitchen. Then I waited until late morning when Mark was home on a call with some lender, his voice tense, and Lisa was scrolling on her phone on the couch. I walked from the basement door to the foot of the stairs, about 10 feet from where Mark stood in the kitchen. I clutched my chest, let out a strangled cry I had practiced in the mirror, and collapsed onto the cold tile floor. I lay still, eyes partially open, breathing shallowly enough to be alarming but not enough to actually hurt. Lisa glanced up from her phone. She looked directly at my body on the floor. Then she looked back at the screen. Mark, still on his call, stepped over my body without breaking stride. His shoes skimmed my shoulder. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed a folder off the counter, and said into the phone, "Yes, hold on, I've got the account numbers right here." He did not look at me. He did not pause. For 47 seconds I lay on that floor while my only child prioritized a loan document over my existence. The silence was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Every last molecule of maternal love I had been preserving, some small hope that he was just weak and led astray, evaporated in that hallway like mist. I sat up slowly, rose to my feet, and walked back to the basement. Neither of them noticed. I had the entire episode on that hidden camera, the timestamp and the indifference preserved in high definition. With all the evidence locked down, Alicia and her team moved with surgical speed. The bank's legal department filed a criminal referral with the county prosecutor for forgery, bank fraud, and elder financial abuse. The trust's protective lien was activated by my sworn affidavit, and the cloud on the title was entered into the county records the same afternoon. The refinance was frozen, the equity locked beyond Mark's reach. But I wanted the final confrontation to happen face to face. I wanted them to know. 2 days before Mark and Lisa were scheduled to file an eviction against me through some attorney they had found in a strip mall, they cornered me in the kitchen. Their faces were masks of frantic urgency, the kind of fear that makes people sloppy. Mark's voice was high and tight. "Mom, we need you to come to the bank right now. Just sign one little correction on the trust paperwork, just a formality. Then this whole mess clears up and we can all go back to normal." Lisa stood behind him, her jaw working a piece of gum so fast it clicked. I nodded slowly, playing the compliant, confused old woman one last time. "If it helps you, sweetheart, of course I'll come." The drive to the local branch was 10 minutes of strained silence. Mark's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Lisa kept glancing at her phone as if waiting for a rescue signal that wasn't coming. At the bank, a loan officer with a nervous smile led us into a small private office, the same one where I later learned they had originally presented my forged signature to the notary. The document on the table was a quitclaim deed, purporting to transfer my life estate back to them and dissolve my interest entirely. All I needed to do was sign. Mark pushed a pen toward me. I picked it up. I set it back down. "No," I said. My voice was calm, almost pleasant. "I'm not signing that. You should have listened to your father's note." Mark's face contorted. "What note? Mom, quit being dramatic. Just sign the paper." The office door opened. Alicia Marsh entered first, her expression unreadable. Behind her came a uniformed detective from the Financial Crimes Unit and a county prosecutor named M.S. Okonkwo, a woman with a gaze like a blade. The detective placed a hand on Mark's shoulder and informed him he was under investigation for felony forgery, elder abuse, and bank fraud. M.S. Okonkwo began reading Lisa her Miranda rights. The loan officer, stunned, edged out of the room. Lisa started shrieking about lawyers and entrapment, but her voice had gone thin and ragged, and no one was listening. The quitclaim deed was seized as evidence in a clear plastic bag. Mark stood frozen, the pen still on the table, his entire scheme collapsing around him like a house of cards. I watched it all from my chair, my hands folded, and I thought of Frank in his workshop, teaching me to feel the click of a shear line. The aftermath was both swift and deeply satisfying. Alicia's case, built on my recordings and the USB extraction and the forged documents, was essentially unassailable. Mark and Lisa were charged with multiple felonies. Their plea deal, negotiated over 8 months and finalized in a county courtroom I attended with Patricia by my side, included full restitution of the $200,000 they had siphoned, mandatory financial counseling, and a very unusual condition tailored by my civil attorney. To avoid prison time, they agreed to a 10-year residential lease agreement, renting the basement apartment from me at fair market value, with strict covenants governing noise, maintenance, and behavior. Any violation, any late payment, any whisper of aggression would trigger immediate eviction and reinstatement of the criminal charges. The trust's penalty clause was executed by the court. Title to the house, free and clear of all their encumbrances, was transferred to me. I owned it outright. The eviction notice they had filed against me was stamped, dismissed with prejudice, and returned to my possession. I moved my things upstairs the following weekend, taking the master suite with its windows that faced the rising sun. I repainted the walls a soft sage green and hung my own photographs, the ones Lisa had not managed to sell, in simple wooden frames. The day the lease was signed, after Mark and Lisa had finished moving their things into the basement, I called a handyman to mount a black frame in my foyer, just to the left of the front door. Inside it, behind glass, is the original eviction notice they had served me, the one that tried to throw me out of my own life. Every month when my son climbs the stairs with his rent check, he has to walk past it. I've never asked how that feels, and I never will. I still have Frank's tin box. It sits on my nightstand now, the note tucked back inside, a permanent reminder that love sometimes means building a locked door between yourself and the people you most wanted to trust. I spent 31 years learning to read locks, but Frank taught me something harder. You cannot pick a lock on a person's character. You can only prepare for when that lock fails and hope you have the tools to survive what comes next. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If this story gave you something to hold on to, please hit that subscribe button and like this video so more people who need to hear about preparedness and self-respect can find it. Until next time, may your locks be strong and your trust well placed.